Welcome back to The Why. We're spending the hour talking about white supremacy and how it's gone global. Back with us is Newsy's senior investigative correspondent Mark Greenblatt, and joining the conversation from Atlanta is Dr. Heidi Beirich from the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. Thank you both for sticking around to have this conversation.
You bet.
Glad to be here.
So, Heidi, this new podcast uncovers important new developments in the evolution of white extremism. What struck you listening to what Mark and his team brought?
Well, I think what's most important here is that Mark and his team have done an incredible job at mapping out how global this phenomenon is, how it transcends borders, reaches all the way from the United States to places like Russia, and also lays out how dangerous white supremacist extremist groups are. So this kind of documentation is actually quite rare, and I think that the podcast gives us a window into a disturbing world, but one that we all have to be aware of.
So, Heidi, Mark spoke to a leader of the Russian imperial movement, the only white supremacist group the U.S. has called an international terror group. What is the U.S. doing to battle this threat, and is it enough?
Well, I would have to say, no, it's not enough. And I think that interview in particular is quite extraordinary because the Russian imperial movement is the only group that's listed as essentially a specially designated terrorist organization that's not one of Islamic extremist beliefs. And this is a person who people don't get to hear from very often. However, the Russian imperial movement is not the only transnational white supremacist terror network that's out there. There are quite a few others, and it's very, very important for the American government to look into these organizations and use all the tools at their disposal, including the kind of designation that they used for the Russian imperial movement, to try to combat these organizations, the ideas they're spreading, and the violence that ultimately comes from those ideas.
Well, Mark, let me ask you that question, too, to get your take on it. What is the U.S. doing to battle them?
Well, look, we got for this podcast one of the first on-camera interviews that the State Department had given. Went to their headquarters, talked to their top people. It's very clear to me that they are very dedicated at battling this problem. The issue is that they're using the wrong toolbox. They're using a toolbox that was built to deal with a threat from post 9/11, a threat that was coming, an Islamist threat largely, and they continue to fight that fight and continue to use that toolbox, and that continues to be an important issue for them to be looking at. But they haven't picked up the other toolbox. It's like they haven't gone and gotten the updated tool chest that can allow them to go after more white supremacists that are the kinds of organizations Heidi's talking about. In particular, they feel like they're frozen in time because of free speech issues. But I think I'd be really interested to hear what Heidi has to say, to that issue.
Yeah, well, I have to say that there's no reason to be frozen around those particular issues, right? There's a completely different legal regime that applies to groups that are headquartered domestically in the United States and those that are abroad, which is the same legal regime used to fight things like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And there's no reason why those enhanced anti-terrorism and counterterrorism tools like tracking money, material support charges, couldn't be used on groups that are white supremacist in nature and headquartered outside the United States.
Well, so in the Verified podcast, Mark, your team reveals old conspiracy theories taking on new life in this international network. A lot of these global white supremacist groups really don't like the United States. Help us understand why that is.
So a lot of this comes down to the fact that they're trying to build, oftentimes, their own white ethno-states where they can literally run societies that are, whites only, white Christians only, the kinds of networks that we really got into in this podcast. And so at the core, the United States, a lot of Western allies are promoting multicultural institutions. But listen, this is also one of the most important parts of the podcast. It's a key takeaway for me because it allows you and I to to actually do something about this. And that is that if you become aware of the code words that are being used that stand in for the United States, things like something like the New World Order is something that we heard parroted again and again and again from a lot of different extremists in this network. And it was something I'd never heard of, but when I started looking into it more, it turns out it's almost akin to a secret society where these people believe there are people that are really running the world. Largely, oftentimes this goes back to Israel. It goes back to the United States. They think that they're under a spell of sorts of a secret society that is making people become more multicultural, and it's not allowing them to go ahead and create these white ethno societies. So as moms and as dads, we can, if we hear these words, New World Order, and become aware of these other conspiracy theories, we can see in our own communities and in our own worlds if people are just maybe a little bit off in a way, or if we hear these words, we know we can actually go ahead and step in or call someone, call a local law enforcement or even federal law enforcement to say, listen, I'm really concerned and I'm hearing these things and I know they're tied to these globally connected ideas. Maybe somebody else should take a look at this.
Heidi, here in the U.S., we had January 6th. The Verified podcast shows that Sweden has also become a hotspot of white nationalism and that our government doesn't know yet why that's the case. So what's happening on the far right in Europe?
Yeah, well, the far right is becoming more radical. Mark just sort of alluded to these conspiracy theories that are spreading. There's a lot of mixing in of anti-vax and anti-mask sort of ideas into this world. It's also becoming more international. In other words, these white supremacist networks are actually tied very closely together. And as has been the case also in the U.S. with these groups, we're seeing more violence. And that's really the scariest part about this. There's a political movement that pushes conspiracy theories. Often Jews are put at the back end of those conspiracy theories, which is always frightening. But then we also have violence. So there's actually been a storming of a parliament building in the last couple weeks, violence related to anti-COVID, anti-mask rallies. And overall, there has been just a really huge growth of far-right populist movements that at the end of the day, when you pull all the strings together, is really being fueled by the kinds of groups and people that this podcast examines.
So then why does that matter to Americans hearing what's going on overseas?
Because we do not exist alone in this space anymore. Those same networks that are growing and proliferating online and offline pose a threat to Americans. Conspiracy theories and the drive for white ethno-states and this idea that white people are being displaced in their own countries, that's what motivated the shooting at the Pittsburgh synagogue, Tree of Life. That's what motivated what happened at an El Paso Walmart. And so these things are just as much a problem for us as they are around the world. And if we don't combat them and don't push back, and if the federal government doesn't do all that it can on this front, we're going to also experience the fallout from all of this.
So let me ask this question to both of you. Mark, your team has made it clear in the podcast that extremist networks who want to build white Christian societies are now reaching out to Iran, Syria, and Islamic militants. What should we make of this?
Well, look, this is one of the scarier things that I think is still unfolding, and we still have a lot more to learn about. But the very people that the Russian Vorobyov introduced me to, that are part of this, that he's saying are supporters of the Last Crusade, they're also telling me that they are actively meeting with other organizations that the United States has designated as terrorists. There's one guy you saw in the video leading off here today as part of your show, Tatevik, that there's one guy that is trying to seek inroads with the government of Iran, and he's tweeting out photos of himself that he says are right there in Iranian government buildings and right moments before he's meeting with senior officials. So if you have white supremacists who really at their core hate the United States and hate Western democracies, and they're somehow finding allies with other organizations or governments that also don't like the United States, it becomes potentially a step larger of an issue. And, you know, I'd really love to hear Heidi's take on this, because it is something we go into in the podcast, but she speaks very eloquently to it there, and I think could do so here.
Well, we're going to pick up this segment with Heidi after the break. We do have to take a break right now. So, Mark, we're going to let you go. But thank you for coming on the show and for your insight and all the work that you have put into this over the last year in this podcast and sharing your expertise with us tonight. So really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Tatevik. So good to be here. Thanks so much for focusing on it in the show.